So to finish up today, we do have a set of notes. It's going to include alloys, which you just learned about in the POGL, semiconductors, polymers, and nanostructures. That's kind of what we're going to be looking at. This is all stuff that has to do with material science. The details of this are not particularly heavily tested on the AP Chem exam. Alloys certainly are, semiconductors a little bit, polymers a little bit, nanostructures do not appear hardly at all. But it is stuff that I believe that's important for you to walk out of a chemistry course with. So, as always, there is a set of notes in Schoology for you to work with this. When you're done, submit summary and questions. All right, so alloys, as you learned in the POGL, are combinations of two or more elements, usually metallic, okay? And so by going ahead and mixing a second or a third element, it changes the properties of the mixture to suit different purposes. So if you wanted a metal to look one way but have different properties in terms of hardness another way, you might mix some metals together by melting them down, mixing them together homogeneously, and then letting it cool. Okay, and so lots of different alloys that exist out there. Brass for making instruments, bronze like a bronze medal or a sculpture, stainless steel, another example of that, sterling silver to make silver harder, gold, 14 karat gold, 18 karat gold, 24 karat gold, those are all alloys. Actually, 24 karat gold is pure gold, but 18 and 14 karat gold are alloys to make gold harder so it doesn't smash or bend like in jewelry and things like that. Dental amalgam is what fillings are made of. And so you can see with those different kinds of alloys, and as you mix them together, what the properties are that result by mixing those metals together. All right. Two main kinds of alloys, substitutional alloys and interstitial alloys. In a substitutional alloy, a second element takes the place of a metal atom, okay? And this happens with atoms of similar radius. So you can just stick a different atom in there. Here's 14 karat gold with silver and gold as in an alloy mix. And you can just shove silver atoms in place of the gold atoms. Why does it work to be substitutional? Because they're about the same size, and so it just slips right into that particular spot. Okay. Properties of a substitutional alloy. Substitutional alloys density typically falls between the density of the constituent metals. So again, because it's just sort of replacing it, you can average out the densities and you'll figure out what the density of the overall alloy is. Substitutional alloys also typically allow you to maintain ductility and malleability because all of these little metal cations can just slip around or move around when they're exposed to a lot of force. Interstitial alloys happen where you have a second element filling a space in metal atoms. And this usually happens where we have atoms of different radius. So in this particular case, you've got a whole bunch of iron atoms in steel, and then you'll slip a carbon atom into the little spaces in between them. Okay, that's interstitial. It's in between the spaces. All right, tends to be more rigid because these little atoms that you're sticking in between tend to lock the other cations in place. It gives them less room to move around, and so it stiffens the whole thing up. It can also be less dense if the interstitial atom is low mass and small. Doesn't always happen because sometimes you can have a high mass interstitial atom that has a very high density. So small ion with a lot of mass is something you could put in there. In that case, the density may not change much. But again, if what you're putting in there is low mass and small, it can decrease the density of your steel alloy, of your interstitial alloy. Another thing that alloy formation can do is change the chemistry of metal surfaces. For example, stainless steel. Okay, in stainless steel, what you do is you create by creating a alloy that has chrome in it. The chrome on the surface will actually react with the oxygen in the air and form a chromium oxide layer. That prevents it from being able to rust. Whereas in regular steel, where you don't have that chromium, you just have the irons exposed on the top and it can rust away. Okay. Another type of material that we oftentimes talk about in chemistry is our semiconductors. Okay, semi means in between, conduction. So again, we talked about these a little bit yesterday. Conduction and semiconductors are in between conductors. They kind of conduct electricity, but not super well. Okay, most common in group 14 metalloids. So silicon, germanium, tin. Okay, those are the places where we most often see the semiconductors. Why? Well, because they have 4 valence electrons and tetrahedral bonding. That's required or convenient for us to be able to get semiconduction happening. Okay, and so what happens is when you have these particular structures in these particular atoms, it only requires a small amount of energy to delocalize the electrons. In other words, to take a little electron and pull it off of this. All right? Once that electron is pulled off of this, it now has space that it can travel through, and you can go ahead and conduct electricity. And so as you can result of that, how can we give energy to the semiconductors? Well, we can increase their temperature. And so semiconductors will become more conductive at higher temperatures. Again, why does this work for these particular atoms? Again, it has to do with their electron configurations and their bonding structures that allows you to delocalize some electrons and make them able to move through and conduct electricity. One thing we can do to take and make semiconductors more conductive is to go ahead and dope them, right? And so doping just simply means taking a very small amounts of impurities and putting them into the semiconductor to increase the conductivity. There's a couple different types of these. So we said that semiconductors are typically group 14 elements, right? So so that means that they have 4 valence electrons off the bat. If I take any of the elements that are in the column to the right of them that have 5 valence electrons and dope that in. So in the case, one particular case we could do would be taking and putting a phosphorus atom into a silicon semiconductor material. If I do that and I get my tetrahedral bonding, it leaves me with an extra valence electron that's sitting there. Okay, that valence electron then is very easy to delocalize. It's extra, it's sitting there, and so you got a free electron that can now move through the structure, making it more conductive. Okay, so again, elements that will do this: antimony, arsenic, phosphorus. They're called N-type or negative doping. Why? Because they have an extra electron, which makes them a little bit more negative in terms of electrons than the silicon. All right, so that's that. There are also P-type doping. These are elements that have 3 valence electrons. So those would be the ones to the right or left of that group 14. Okay, 3 valence electrons. Boron, aluminum, germanium. Okay, and so what happens there for these ones is when you have only 3 valence electrons coming in, you can only complete 3 of those tetrahedral bonds. And so what that happens is it then leaves what we call a hole where silicon has nothing to bond to. That means then that electrons can jump into that hole, okay, and jump to a different hole and jump to a different hole. Those electrons can do that. And so by doing that, that again makes a method by which the electrons can move more simply through the material. This is called P-type for positive because, again, these have less electrons, so they are more positive. So P-type are to the left, N-type are to the right. One other thing that happens with semiconductors is what you can make is what's called a diode. Okay, and diodes are very important in computing, and basically what it does is it allows you to control the flow of electrons in one direction. So if you put an N-type next to a P-type, it allows you to go ahead and take the extra electron in the N-type and make it jump to the P-type hole. Okay, and so you can't really make current fly across that, but what you can do is if you attach a battery to it, you can push those electrons across the junction and make the electrons travel just in one direction. Okay, so this is the basis for things like LED lighting, which are all the rage in light bulbs, as well as computer circuits. Okay. third type of material we want to talk about today are polymers. Okay, polymers are molecules of high molecular mass made by putting together repeating units called monomers. You learned about these in biology when you learned about the macromolecules like carbohydrates and amino acids and deoxynucleic acids like DNA and RNA. All right. So basically what you do is you take a whole bunch of single molecules, alter up their bonds, and turn them into a long chain. Okay. This is ethylene. It can be turned into polyethylene through a polymer reaction. Polymer reactions happen in two primary ways. One is an addition polymer. In an addition polymer, what we do is we break double bonds. When we do that, what we end up with is structures that look like this. Returning a free electron back to each atom. If we do that on another molecule, you now have a place where these two can share electrons and bond, and so that just continues to propagate down the way, and you get a big long chain of polyethylene. At some point, a hydrogen atom comes in and connects on the end here, and that stops the polymer reaction, but that usually doesn't happen for hundreds or sometimes thousands of molecules. The other kind of polymer reaction that oftentimes will happen is condensation. Condensation polymers are made by taking two subunits which form a smaller molecule, often water, which is where we get the name condensation for, that is formed as a byproduct. Okay, this happens in amino acids, for example. So you take a hydrogen from one end of one molecule, a hydroxide from the other end of another molecule, cut that out, giving us water, H2O, and then the two atoms that are left connect together, which creates your long chain. Okay. Some other interesting things that happen with polymers is that there are interactions between the chains of polymers. Okay, so based on dispersion forces, sometimes hydrogen bonding, sometimes even dipole-dipole forces, you can get things that where the chains interact with one another. Okay, this is an example of this is where you get protein shapes in biology. So there are hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions, areas that attract water and areas that repel from water. And so as a result of that, your chain of amino acids will start folding up, and eventually you get a nicely folded up protein that is held together in a particular shape or arrangement, because there are hydrogen bonds and dispersion forces interacting between the different parts of the molecule. One particular feature of polymers that you can get is side chains. Okay, so here's your main chain of molecules that are connecting together in a polymer chain, and sometimes you can get side chains that come down the sides. Okay, what do those side chains do? Well, a couple things that they do. One, they make it so that you can't bring another main chain super close to this main chain because it gets blocked out by the side chains. And so as a result of that, more side chains means you are less dense because you cannot get the main chains close to each other. The other thing that this does is transparency. More side chains makes things more transparent. Why? Because light can more easily go through these spaces between the main chains where the side chains are. So light is able to go through. That makes things more transparent. Sometimes side chains will go all the way to another chain and actually connect them. If that's the case, we call that cross-linking. Okay, so that actually is chemically bonding polymer chains to each other, and what it typically does is it stiffens and strengthens our polymer. The last kind of particle that we want to talk about, material we talk about, are nanoparticles. Okay, and so these are molecules that exist at a nanoscale. They have properties that are different than in larger solids, and probably the most famous of these are carbon nanostructures, where you take carbon molecule or atoms and you arrange them in specific ways. The first one of these that was discovered was this molecule right here, carbon-60, which is known as Buckminster fullerene or buckyballs. Okay. They then took these and they cut off ends of them and figured out how to go ahead and make them into longer tubes, which we would call Bucky tubes. There's also a new material super strong material that we refer to as graphene, which is basically just a single layer of graphite. Goes off in lots of different directions, and when it does that, you can get these films or sheets of this graphene that are extremely, extremely strong. And the other thing that you can do with nanostructures is create semiconductors without doping them.